Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins. In the days when the world was younger and the stars sang clearer songs in the vast halls of night, there came a season of unease to the realm of Ethermore. The great forests whispered of shadows stirring in places long forgotten, and the winds carried upon their breath a coldness that spoke not of winter's natural coming, but of something far more ancient and dire awakening in the deep places of the earth. Erengala the Tall, High King of the Starward Throne, and last bearer of the crown of 7 stars, stood upon the marble balcony of Khazad-dûm, his fortress palace that rose like a spear of white stone from the heart of the silverwood. The autumn had been long that year, longer than any in the memory of even the eldest of his people, and the leaves that should have fallen in golden splendor clung still to their branches, brown and withered, as if afraid to touch the earth below. The king's grey eyes, keen as the light of Erendil's star, gazed southward toward the misty marshes where once the great city of Tol Morwen had stood in glory. Now only ruins remained there, half swallowed by the creeping waters and the grasping roots of trees that grew too dark and too twisted for nature's making. It was from that direction that the wrongness came, like a foul wind that no season could explain. "My lord," Galador said, his voice tight with worry, "you should not have ridden alone into such peril." Erengala dismounted, his legs stiff from the long ride. "What I found there could not be faced by many, old friend. The darkness spreads through corruption of the spirit, not strength of arms." He told them briefly of the Tower of the Moon and the corrupted Palantir, watching as their faces grew grave with understanding. These were seasoned warriors who had faced orc raids and border disputes, but this was something beyond their experience, an enemy that struck at the heart rather than the body. "What are your orders, my lord?" Galador asked. "Ride hard to Khazad-dûm," the king replied. "Summon the Council of Stars and bid them prepare for war, but not the war they expect. This enemy will come first as whispers and doubt, turning friend against friend before ever sword is drawn." As his knights rode north with urgent purpose, Erengala remained at the tower with only 2 guards. He climbed again to the beacon chamber, but this time he lit no signal fire. Instead, he sat in meditation as the sun sank toward the western horizon, his mind reaching out across the leagues to touch other points of light in the growing darkness. For the enemy had shown him one truth in that cursed tower. He was not the only one to feel the stirring shadow. Across the world, other guardians kept their vigil. Other beacons stood ready to blaze defiance against the night. The question was whether they would stand together or fall divided, each believing themselves alone against the dark. As the first stars appeared overhead, Erengala felt a familiar presence touch his thoughts. Mithrilla's, her mind bright with concern and relief. "You have returned to us," her voice whispered across the distance. "But you bring heavy tidings." "Heavier than you know," he replied. "The old enemy stirs beyond the void, and his servants walk again in Middle-earth. We must prepare for the longest night our people have ever known." Yet even as he spoke these words of warning, the king felt a spark of hope kindle in his heart. For in the Tower of the Moon, facing the malice of ages, His sword had blazed with light undimmed. The flame of the star-touched still burned bright, and while it endured, the darkness would not have final victory. The war for the soul of the world was about to begin. When dawn broke grey and cheerless over the silverwood, Erengala walked alone among the ancient paths that wound between the great malon trees of his ancestors. The morning mist clung to the earth like the breath of sleeping giants, and no bird sang in the branches overhead. Even the leaves, which should have rustled with the music of wind and life, hung silent as shrouds in the still air. Here, in this sacred grove where the first star-touched had planted the seedlings brought from the undying lands beyond the sea, the king sought counsel from older wisdom than dwelt in the minds of mortal men. These trees had stood when the world was young, their roots drinking deep from springs that had their source in the very foundations of the earth. They had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, the passage of ages, the slow turning of the wheel of time that ground all things to dust. Yet still they endured, keepers of memory and guardians of hope. The path led him at last to the heart of the grove, where the great tree stood in majesty and solitude, taller than the towers of men, broader than the halls of kings. Its silver bark gleamed with an inner light that neither sun nor moon could kindle. This was Celebros the Mighty, the tree of stars, beneath whose boughs the first compact had been made between the children of Iluvatar and the powers of the West. As Erengala approached the mighty trunk, placing his hand upon the smooth silver bark, a voice spoke, not in words that the ear could hear, but in the deep language of root and branch, of sap and leaf, that the star-touched had learned in the days of their youth. King of men, the voice whispered like wind through summer leaves, why do you come with sorrow in your heart to the place where joy was born? Because sorrow is all that remains to me, Ancient One, Erengala replied in the same tongue. The darkness stirs, and I know not how to turn it back. My people look to me for wisdom, but I am only a man, and the weight of kingship grows heavy upon my shoulders. The great tree was silent for a moment, and in that silence the king heard the slow, deep breathing of the earth itself, the pulse of life that flowed through all growing things. When the voice came again, it carried within it the sadness of autumn and the promise of spring. Long have we stood here, you and I, and all our kindred, watching the wheel turn and the ages pass. We have seen the light grow dim and the shadow lengthen, yet always the sun has risen again upon a world made new. But now there comes a darkness that is different from all that have gone before. What darkness? Erengala asked, though his heart already trembled to know the answer. In the deep places of the world, where the roots of mountains have their foundation, something stirs that should have remained sleeping until the end of days. The Nameless One, whom we do not speak of save in whispers, reaches out his hand from the void beyond the circles of the world. His servants walk again in Middle-earth, and his eye turns toward the lands of the living. The king felt a chill deeper than winter settle in his bones. The Nameless One, Morgoth the Dark, the first and greatest of evils, who had been thrust beyond the walls of the world in the elder days and bound there by the power of the Valar themselves. If he was stirring again, if his influence could reach across the void to touch the world of light and life. But he cannot return, Erengala said, and heard the desperate hope in his own voice. The doors of night are barred against him, and the straight road is closed to his passing. Cannot, perhaps, the tree replied. But his will is strong, and his hatred burns like a flame that consumes all it touches. He has found another way, King of men. Through his servants, through the corruption of fair things, through the slow poison of despair that seeps into the hearts of the living. Already his shadow falls upon the southern lands, and the very stones cry out in anguish. Around them, the other trees of the grove began to sway and murmur, their branches moving in a wind that touched no other growing thing. Their voices joined with that of the great tree, creating a harmony of warning that seemed to echo from the very foundations of the earth. Go south, they sang together, their voices like the rush of many waters. Go south to the place where darkness gathers, but go not alone. Take with you the light that burns within your heart and the hope that lives in the blood of your people. For in the end, it is not the strength of arms or the wisdom of kings that will turn back the shadow, but the courage of simple folk who choose to stand against the dark. The south, Erengala whispered. But that way lies only wasteland and ruin. What could I hope to find there save death and sorrow? Truth, came the answer, as final as the turning of the seasons. Truth, and perhaps the key to a lock that has held for too long. The shadow spreads because it feeds upon ignorance and fear, but knowledge is a light that no darkness can wholly quench. And there are those who yet remember the words of power that were spoken in the elder days. The voices of the trees began to fade, withdrawing into the deep silence of root and earth. But before they fell completely still, one last whisper reached the king's ears, soft as the falling of leaves in autumn. Remember, son of the star-touched, that even the smallest light can hold back the greatest darkness if the heart that bears it is true. Erengala stood for a long time beneath the great tree, his hand still pressed against its silver bark, feeling the slow pulse of life that flowed through its ancient wood. When at last he turned away, his step was firmer than it had been, his shoulders straighter beneath the weight of kingship. The path before him was dark and uncertain, but he was no longer walking it alone. As he made his way back through the winding paths of the silverwood, the first ray of true sunlight broke through the clouds overhead, touching the leaves with gold and setting the morning mist to sparkling like a veil of jewels. Somewhere in the distance, a thrush began to sing, its voice clear and sweet in the morning air. The shadow was spreading, yes, but the light had not yet failed. 3 days hence, when the moon hung like a silver sickle in the star-crowded sky, a lone rider departed from the gates of Caer Lumineth. No fanfare attended his going, no banners streamed in the wind behind him. He rode in silence and secrecy, cloaked in grey wool and bearing no mark of his royal station, save the sword at his side and the light that seemed to gather around him like captured starfire. Erengala had chosen to make this journey alone, against the counsel of all his advisors and the pleas of his people. Captain Galador had begged leave to accompany him with a company of the Swan Knights, their bright mail gleaming and their lances sharp for war. Mithrillers had spoken long of the danger of riding unguarded into lands where evil stirred, her wise voice heavy with foreboding. Even old Círdan the shipwright, eldest of all who dwelt in Caer Lumineth, had come from his harbours to counsel the king against this path. But the words of the great tree echoed still in Erengala's heart, and he knew with the certainty that comes only from the deepest wisdom that this was a road he must walk alone. In the elder tales, it was always the solitary wanderer who discovered the hidden paths, the secret doors, the forgotten truths that could turn the tide of war and change the fate of nations. His horse was Rochelor, a stallion of the Miara's breed, whose coat shone silver white in the moonlight and whose eyes held the flame of the undying lands. Swifter than the wind was he, and wiser than many who walked on two legs, understanding the speech of his master and the needs of the road with an intelligence that bordered on the mystical. They rode south through the night, following paths that wound between the hills and dales of Ethermoor, like threads of silver in a tapestry of green and gold. The land here was fair still, unmarked by the shadow that crept from the southern wastes, but even so, the king could feel a change in the very air he breathed. The stars seemed dimmer than they had been in his youth, and the wind carried scents that spoke of distant burning and decay. By dawn, they had reached the borders of the realm, where the ordered farmlands and villages of his people gave way to the wild country that stretched away toward the misty marshes. Here stood the southward tower, a spear of white stone that rose from a hill crowned with rowan trees, its beacon fire dark and cold as the messenger had reported. Erengala dismounted at the tower's base and climbed the winding stair that led to its summit, his footsteps echoing hollow in the stone corridors. The chamber at the top was empty, its great hearth filled with cold ashes and its windows staring blindly out over the southern lands. The keeper of the tower was gone, his few possessions scattered, as if he had fled in haste, leaving behind only questions and the lingering smell of fear. From the tower's height, the king could see far across the marshlands to where the ruins of Tol Morwen brooded like a wound in the earth. Once that city had been fair and proud, its white towers reaching toward heaven and its gardens blooming with flowers that had no name in the common tongue. But that was before the plague years, before the waters rose and the trees grew twisted, before the very stones began to weep with sorrow for what they had lost. Now it was a place of desolation, shunned by all living things save the carrion birds that wheeled endlessly above its broken walls. Yet even from this distance, Erengala could see that something had changed there. A faint glow emanated from the ruins, neither the warm light of fire nor the cold radiance of the stars, but something else, something that made his blood run chill and his hand tighten on the hilt of his sword. "So," he murmured to the empty air, "the tree spoke truly. The darkness has found a home in the place where light once dwelt." He descended from the tower and remounted Rochelor, turning the stallion's head toward the marshlands and the ruins beyond. The horse snorted and tossed his mane, clearly reluctant to approach that accursed place, but he obeyed his master's will, as he had always done. The path led down from the hill, through country that grew wilder and stranger with each passing league. The grass grew rank and coarse, and the trees that dotted the landscape were gnarled and leafless, their branches reaching toward the sky like the arms of supplicants. Strange mists began to rise from the ground as the sun climbed higher, mists that moved against the wind and seemed to whisper with voices that had no source. By midday, they had reached the edge of the marshlands proper, where the solid ground gave way to a maze of waterways and soggy islands connected by paths that only the desperate or the mad would dare to tread. The air here was thick and oppressive, heavy with the smell of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. No bird sang, no insect buzzed, no fish jumped in the dark waters that reflected nothing but emptiness. Erengala paused at the marsh's edge, studying the treacherous paths that wound away into the mist. Somewhere ahead, hidden among the reeds and willows, lay the causeway that led to Tol Morwen, if causeway it could still be called after so many years of neglect and decay. The way was dangerous, fraught with pitfalls and false turnings that could lead an unwary traveller to a watery grave. But the king had not come so far to turn back at the first sign of peril. Touching his heels to Rochela's flanks, he urged the stallion forward onto the narrow path that led into the heart of the marshlands. Behind them, the last solid ground of Ethermoor fell away into mist and memory, and ahead lay only shadow and the unknown. As they picked their way carefully along the winding path, the silence of the marshlands pressed around them like a living thing. Even the sound of Rochela's hooves was muffled by the soft ground and the thick air, as if the very marsh was trying to swallow every trace of their passing. Once or twice, Erengala thought he heard voices calling from the mist, now pleading, now warning, now singing songs of lamentation that had no words. But when he turned to look, there was nothing to be seen save the endless reaches of water and reed and the pale wisps of vapour that danced like ghosts above the dark pools. The path twisted and turned, doubled back on itself, branched and rejoined in patterns that seemed to follow no earthly logic. Time moved strangely here, and the king could not tell if they had been riding for hours or days. The sun, when it could be glimpsed through the perpetual mist, seemed to hang motionless in the sky, neither advancing nor retreating, but simply existing in an eternal moment of grey despair. At last, when hope had begun to fade and even Rochela's mighty heart was flagging, they came upon a sight that made Erengala rein in his mount with a sharp intake of breath. Rising from the mist ahead, like the prow of some vast ship, the first towers of Tol Morwen stood revealed in all their ruined majesty. The causeway lay before them, its ancient stones still holding firm despite the waters that lapped at its edges. And from the towers beyond came that strange glow the king had glimpsed from afar, stronger now, pulsing like a heartbeat in the grey twilight of the marsh. Erengala set his jaw and rode forward into the shadow of the city of the dead. The ruins of Tol Morwen rose before the king like the bones of some immense beast, picked clean by time and sorrow. Once proud towers leaned at impossible angles, their tops lost in the perpetual mist that clung to the dead city like a shroud. Bridges that had once spanned graceful arcs between the buildings now hung in broken fragments, their stones scattered in the dark waters below. Gardens that had bloomed with flowers from the undying lands were now choked with thorns and nettles that grew with unnatural vigour, their barbs gleaming like black metal in the strange light that emanated from the city's heart. Yet for all its desolation, Tol Morwen was not empty. As Erengala guided Rochela along the crumbling causeway, he became aware of movement among the ruins, shadows that shifted and flowed like water, shapes that might have been men or might have been something else entirely. They did not approach these watchers in the mist, but he felt their eyes upon him like cold fingers tracing patterns on his skin. The causeway ended at a great gate whose doors had long since rotted away, leaving only an archway crowned with carvings so weathered that their original meaning was lost to time. Beyond lay a courtyard filled with stagnant pools and fallen masonry, where statues of forgotten kings stood headless and broken among the weeds. The silence here was absolute, pressing against the ears like the weight of deep water. Erengala dismounted and bid Rocula wait, knowing that the faithful stallion would remain until his master's return, or until the ending of the world, whichever came first. Then, drawing his cloak closer about his shoulders, he stepped through the ruined gate into the city of the dead. The streets of Tol Morwen wound upward in a spiral pattern, following the contours of the great hill upon which the city had been built. As the king climbed higher, the mist began to thin, revealing more of the devastation that had overtaken this once fair place. Houses stood with their roofs collapsed and their walls split by the roots of trees that should never have grown in soil touched by salt water. Fountains that had once sung with clear voices now wept tears of black water that stained the marble with streaks like old blood. But it was not the physical decay that struck terror into Erengala's heart. It was the wrongness that permeated everything, the sense that the very stones had been corrupted by some foul presence. The air itself seemed thick with malice, and every step forward required an effort of will that left him drained and weary. As he climbed higher still, the source of the strange glow became clear. At the city's heart stood a tower taller and more graceful than all the rest, its white stone unmarked by time or weather. This was the Tower of the Moon, where the lords of Tol Morwen had once studied the movements of the stars and communed with the powers beyond the circles of the world. But now, the crystal dome at its summit burned with a light that was neither silver nor gold, but something in between, a sickly radiance that hurt the eyes to look upon and filled the beholder's mind with whispers of despair. The tower's door stood open, revealing a spiral stair that wound upward into darkness. Erengala paused at the threshold, his hand on the pommel of his sword, knowing that whatever lay beyond would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. But the words of the great tree echoed in his memory, and he knew that truth, whatever the cost, was worth any peril. He began to climb. The stairs seemed to go on forever, winding upward through chambers filled with the remnants of ancient learning. Here were scrolls that crumbled to dust at his passing. There were instruments of silver and crystal whose purpose had been forgotten when the world was young. The walls were covered with murals depicting the history of Tol Morwen, from its founding in the days of glory to its abandonment in the time of plague. But as he climbed higher, the images began to change, becoming darker and more disturbing. The faces of the painted figures grew twisted with malice, their eyes following his progress with expressions of hunger and hate. At last, he reached the chamber beneath the crystal dome, and there he stopped, his breath catching in his throat at what he saw. The room was circular, its walls lined with mirrors of polished silver that reflected the strange light in endless patterns. In the center stood a table of black stone, and upon it lay something that made the king's blood run cold. It was a palantir, one of the seeing stones of the elder days, wrought by the skill of the Númenóreans, and blessed with the power to show visions of far places and distant times. But this stone was wrong, its crystal surface stained with veins of red and black that pulsed like a heartbeat. The light that emanated from within was the source of the glow that had drawn him here, and as he watched, images began to form within its depths, Visions of war and conquest, of cities burning and kingdoms falling, of a great eye of flame that searched the world for something precious and lost. "Welcome, King of the Star-touched," came a voice from the shadows, soft as silk and cold as winter wind. "I have been expecting you." Erengala spun around, his sword leaping to his hand with a ring of steel. But the chamber appeared empty save for himself and the corrupted Palantir. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing from the mirrors and the stone walls, until it seemed to fill the very air he breathed. "Who speaks?" he demanded, though his heart already knew the answer and trembled to hear it confirmed. "I am the shadow that falls before the dawn," the voice replied, and now it seemed to come from the Palantir itself, the stone pulsing brighter with each word. "I am the whisper in the darkness, the doubt that gnaws at the heart of heroes. I am the servant of the one who was cast down, but who shall rise again to claim what was taken from him." "You lie," Erengala said, but his voice sounded weak and small in the vastness of the chamber. "The Nameless One is bound beyond the circles of the world, and his servants are scattered like dust before the wind." Laughter echoed from the mirrors, cold and mirthless as the sound of breaking glass. "Bound, yes, but not powerless. Even from beyond the void, his will reaches out to touch the hearts of the living. And there are those among your own, people, proud king, who have heard his call and found it sweet." Images began to form in the mirrors now, reflecting not the chamber where Erengala stood, but scenes from across the world. He saw armies marching under banners of black and red, their faces hidden behind masks of iron and bone. He saw cities ablaze and refugees fleeing along roads choked with smoke and ash. He saw the northern kingdoms falling one by one, their kings slain and their people enslaved. "This is what comes," the voice whispered, and now it seemed to speak directly in his mind. "This is the fate that awaits all who oppose the return of the rightful Lord of Middle-earth. Join us willingly, and you shall be spared. Resist, and you shall watch your realm burn as others have burned." "Never," Erengala replied, and his voice rang clear and strong in the chamber. The light of his sword seemed to grow brighter, pushing back the shadows that pressed around him. "I am sworn to defend the light, and I shall not break faith while breath remains in my body." The mirrors began to crack and shatter, sending shards of silver spinning through the air like deadly rain. The Palantir blazed with malevolent fire, and the voice rose to a shriek of rage and frustration. "Then you have chosen death," it cried, "and death shall find you, Erengala the Proud, sooner than you think." The king raised his sword high, and the blade burst into flame. Not the consuming fire of destruction, but the pure white flame of the undying lands that burns away all corruption and evil. The light struck the Palantir like a physical blow, and the stone cracked with a sound like thunder. For a moment, the chamber was filled with competing radiances, the sick glow of the corrupted seeing stone and the clean fire of the sword of kings. Then, with a final shriek of defeat, the evil light was quenched, and the Palantir crumbled to dust upon the table of black stone. In the sudden silence that followed, Erengala stood breathing heavily, his sword still wreathed in dying flames. The mirrors were dark now, their silver surfaces reflecting nothing but his own weary face. The Tower of the Moon was cleansed, but he knew that what he had faced here was only a shadow of the true darkness that was stirring in the world. Outside, The mist was beginning to lift from the ruins of Tol Morwen, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The king sheathed his sword and made his way back down the spiral stair, through the empty streets, and across the causeway to where Rochelor waited with the patience of ages. As they rode back through the marshlands toward the clean air of Ethermoor, Erengala's mind was heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The enemy had shown his hand, revealing both his strength and his weakness. There would be war, that much was certain. But there would also be hope, for the light had not yet failed, and there were those who would stand against the darkness no matter the sure cost. The long road home stretched before them, and dawn was still many hours away. The ancient stones of Tol Morwen wept as Erengala descended deeper into the ruins, each step carrying him further from the clean air of the world above, and deeper into the heart of corruption that had festered here for centuries unnumbered. The passages beneath the Tower of the Moon were carved from living rock, their walls adorned with murals that had once depicted the glory of the elder days, but now showed only twisted forms that writhed in perpetual torment. The king's sword, Alcarinque, gleamed with its own inner light as he made his way through corridors where no honest illumination had shone for generations. The blade's radiance revealed horrors that mortal eyes were never meant to witness, alcoves filled with bones that had been gnawed by things with too many teeth, pools of water that reflected not the bearer's face, but his deepest fears, doorways sealed with iron bands inscribed with runes that hurt to look upon. Yet it was not these physical manifestations of evil that troubled him most deeply, but the weight of malice that pressed against his spirit like a tide of poisoned water. Each breath was an effort, each heartbeat a struggle against the despair that sought to overwhelm his will. The very air seemed thick with the accumulated anguish of those who had died in these halls, their final screams still echoing in the stone. "Turn back, king of fading light," whispered voices from the shadows, speaking in tongues both ancient and corrupt. "Turn back while yet you may, for ahead lies only madness and death. The necromancer's power is beyond your understanding, his servants beyond your ability to face." But Erengala pressed onward, his jaw set with the determination that had carried his people through 3 ages of struggle against the dark. The crown of 7 stars upon his brow blazed with starfire, each gem a beacon of hope in the suffocating blackness. He had not come so far to be turned aside by whispers and shadows, however terrible they might be. The passage opened at last into a vast chamber carved from the living rock of the hill, its ceiling lost in darkness high above. Ancient pillars, twisted and blackened by centuries of corruption, supported the weight of stone and malice that pressed down from above. But it was what lay at the chamber's heart that drew the king's horrified gaze. A great pit filled with water so black it seemed to drink the light, its surface disturbed by movements that spoke of things better left undescribed. Around the pit's edge stood figures that had once been men, their forms twisted by dark sorcery into shapes that mocked the image in which they had been created. They moved with the jerky motions of marionettes, their empty eye sockets weeping tears of shadow as they performed some ritual whose purpose was mercifully unclear. But even these abominations were not the true horror of the place. That distinction belonged to the thing that rose from the black waters at the chamber's heart, a form of shadow and malice given physical shape, its eyes burning with the cold fire of stars that had died before the world was made. This was one of the Ulari, the Nazgul lords who served the enemy in death as they had never served the light in life. "Welcome, Erin Galar the Tall," it spoke, its voice like the grinding of tombstones in the wind. "I am the Dwimmerlake, the Phantom King, and I have been waiting long for this meeting. Did you think to challenge the power of my master with nothing but steel and starlight? Did you believe that mortal courage could stand against the authority of the void?" The king raised his sword, its flame burning brighter in response to the proximity of such concentrated evil. "I believe that light endures, whatever darkness may come against it. I believe that hope lives in the hearts of the free, and that no shadow can quench it entirely." The Nazgul Lord laughed, a sound like breaking glass in a charnel house. "Hope? What is hope but delayed despair? Look around you, brave king. See what becomes of those who trust in light and justice. See how their bones bleach in the darkness, how their spirits are bound to serve the very evil they sought to defeat." As if summoned by his words, the twisted figures around the pit's edge turned toward the king, their movements becoming more coordinated and purposeful. They began to chant in the black speech, their voices joining in a harmony of corruption that made the very stones tremble with revulsion. But Erengala stood firm, his sword blazing like a star in his hands as he spoke words of power in the ancient tongue of Valinor. Where the light of his blade touched the corrupted figures, they cried out in pain and fell back, their forms beginning to dissolve like mist before the wind. "You have some skill," the Dwimmerlike admitted, its burning eyes fixed upon the king with something approaching respect. "But skill alone will not serve you here. This place was made for darker purposes than your mind can grasp, shaped by will and malice over centuries of patient labor. Here, shadow reigns supreme, and light is but a brief candle soon to be extinguished." The battle that followed was unlike any the king had ever fought, for it was waged as much in the realm of spirit as in the world of flesh and steel. The Nazgul Lord's blade was wrought of shadow and despair, each stroke carrying with it the weight of ages and the promise of ultimate defeat. But Al-Karinque sang with the music of creation itself, its edge sharp enough to cut the bonds between body and spirit, its light pure enough to burn away even the deepest corruption. They fought across the chamber's breadth, their battle illuminated by the clash of opposing forces, darkness against light, despair against hope, the ending of all things against their eternal renewal. Where their blades met, sparks of power flew like falling stars, and the very air crackled with energies that had not been unleashed since the making of the world. In the end, it was not strength of arm that decided the contest, but strength of will. The Dwimmerlake, for all its power and malice, was a thing of endings, bound to the service of destruction and decay. But Erengala carried within his heart the light of the undying lands, the memory of creation's dawn when all things were new and fair. With a final cry that shook the very foundations of Tol Morwen, the king drove his blade deep into the Nazgul Lord's heart of shadow. The creature dissolved with a shriek that seemed to go on forever, its essence scattered like smoke before a hurricane. The corrupted figures around the pit crumbled to dust, their long torment finally ended. But even in victory, Erengala knew that he had faced only a shadow of the true enemy, a fragment of a will that spanned continents and commanded the allegiance of dragons. The real battle was yet to come, and it would require more than courage and steel to win it. As he made his way back toward the surface and the clean air of the world above, the king carried with him the knowledge of what lay ahead and the determination to face it, whatever the cost might be. In the depths beneath Tol Morwen, where neither sun nor star had shone for centuries unnumbered, something stirred in chains of black iron. The destruction of the Palantir above had sent tremors through the foundations of the ruined city, and in the deepest dungeon carved from living rock, a prisoner who had been forgotten by time itself lifted his head and tasted hope for the first time in an age of the world. Thranduil the Golden had once been a king among the Eldar, ruler of the great realm of Erin Lasgallen, where the trees grew tall and the rivers ran swift and clear. But that was before the plague years, before the darkness had crept into his woodland halls and turned his own people against him. Now he was a shadow of his former glory, his bright mail tarnished to grey, his golden hair dulled with the dust of long captivity. The chains that bound him were not merely of iron, but of malice itself, wrought by the craft of the enemy to hold both body and spirit in thrall. For long ages he had hung in that lightless place, neither fully alive nor permitted to die, his strength slowly drained to feed the corrupt visions in the Palantir above. But now the stone was broken, and the bonds that held him had weakened like ice beneath the spring sun. With effort that cost him dearly, Thranduil raised his head and looked about the chamber that had been his prison. The walls were covered with carvings that hurt the eyes to see, twisted forms that writhed and leered in the dim phosphorescence that emanated from fungoid growths in the corners. Somewhere in the darkness, water dripped with the slow persistence of ages, each drop echoing like a funeral bell in the silence. But he was no longer alone in his captivity. During the long years of his imprisonment, others had been brought to share his fate. Kings and heroes, wise women and mighty warriors, all who had stood too long in the light and thus drawn the attention of the shadow. They hung in their chains like broken dolls, their spirits crushed by centuries of torment, their minds lost in mazes of despair from which there seemed no escape. Yet now, as the power of the Palantir failed and the walls of their prison trembled, some few began to stir. Isildur the Tall, last king of the Dunedain, opened eyes that had been closed for 500 years. Lady Galadriel of the Golden Wood, her light dimmed but not extinguished, turned her face toward her fellow prisoners. Others too began to wake from the dark dreams that had held them, blinking in confusion as they tried to remember who they had been before the darkness claimed them. Brothers and sisters in sorrow, Thranduil spoke, his voice cracked with disuse but still carrying the authority of one born to command. The bonds are weakening. I feel the old strength returning to my limbs. Is it possible? Whispered Isildur, flexing fingers that had been still as stone for centuries. Can it be that our long torment draws toward its end? Something has happened above, said Galadriel, her voice like silver bells heard across a great distance. The source of our binding has been broken. I sense one of the star-touched walked in the upper halls and faced the shadow with fire and blade. Hope, that most dangerous and precious of gifts, began to kindle in the hearts of the prisoners. One by one, they tested their bonds and felt them give way like rotten rope. The iron chains that had held them for so long fell clanging to the stone floor, their power spent. But freedom from their bonds was only the first step. They were still trapped in the depths of a ruined city, their strength depleted by long captivity, their way to the surface blocked by guardians whose malice was old and deep. "We must move carefully," Thranduil warned as his companions struggled to their feet. "Though the Palantir is broken, this place still reeks with the presence of the enemy. His servants will not let us go easily." Indeed, even as he spoke, they could hear sounds from the corridors beyond their prison. The scrape of clawed feet on stone, the whisper of voices that spoke in no earthly tongue. The creatures that dwelt in the darkness beneath Tol Morwen had felt the breaking of their master's eye, and they were stirring to wrathful life. "Then we fight," said Isildur grimly, though he bore no weapon save his will and his hands. "Better to die in battle than to return to those cursed chains." But Galadriel raised her hand for silence, her eyes distant with the sight that was her gift. "Wait," she murmured. "There is another way, a path that leads not up to the surface but deeper still, into the very roots of the earth. Dangerous it is, and dark beyond imagining, but it may be our only hope of escape." "The old road," Thranduil breathed, understanding flashing in his eyes. "The secret way that was delved in the elder days, when the fathers of men first came to these shores. But that path leads through the halls of the sleepless, where dwells the Watcher in the dark." "All paths are perilous now," Galadriel replied. "But the Watcher has no love for the servants of the Shadow, for they disturbed its ancient slumber with their digging and delving. It may be that we can pass through its domain if we show proper respect for its age and power." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied now by the rasp of drawn steel and the guttural voices of orcs speaking in the black speech. Time was running short, and soon their escape route would be discovered. "Lead on, Lady of Light," Thranduil said, gathering the other prisoners with a gesture. "Whatever lies ahead cannot be worse than what we leave behind." Galadriel moved to a section of the wall that looked no different from any other, but at her touch, ancient mechanisms stirred to life. Stone ground against stone, and a hidden door swung open on hinges that had not moved since the breaking of the world. Beyond lay a tunnel carved from living rock, its walls smooth as glass and its floor worn by the passage of countless feet in ages past. One by one, the escaped prisoners filed through the doorway into the tunnel beyond. Behind them, the sounds of their pursuers grew ever louder. Shouts of rage as the empty chains were discovered, the baying of hunting hounds bred in darkness to track by scent alone. But ahead lay only silence and the weight of stone, and the hope that somewhere in the deep places of the earth they might find a way back to the light. The door ground shut behind them, sealing them into the old road and the perilous journey that awaited. In the darkness ahead, ancient powers stirred, and the Watcher in the dark opened eyes that had been closed since the world was young. In the high tower of Barad Nimrais, the fortress of white horns that stood guard over the passes of the southern mountains, Mithrellas the Wise sat before the great Palantir of the west and felt the world shifting around her like a ship in a storm. The seeing stone showed her visions that made her heart grow cold. Armies gathering in the eastern wastelands, dragons stirring in their mountain lairs, and over all a growing shadow that seemed to reach out from beyond the circles of the world itself. But it was not these distant perils that troubled her most. 3 days had passed since Erengaila's return from Tol Morwen, and in that time the very air of Ethermore had grown thick with whispers. She could feel them even now, sliding through her thoughts like serpents made of shadow and malice. They spoke of doubt and despair, of the futility of resistance and the sweetness of surrender. They promised peace to those who would kneel and swift death to those who would not. The voice that spoke loudest among these whispers was one that chilled her to the bone, for she recognized it from the darkest tales of the elder days. It was the voice of the necromancer, the shadow that had fallen upon the world when Morgoth the Dark was cast into the void. His true name was not spoken aloud, but the wise knew him as Sauron the Deceiver, the corrupter of hearts, the Dark Lord who sought always to claim dominion over all that lived and breathed. Wise woman of the West, the voice came to her now through the Palantir, soft as silk and sharp as poison. How long will you cling to your failing light? The age of the Eldar passes, and the time of shadow begins. Join with me willingly, and I will make you a queen among queens. Resist, and watch your beloved realm crumble to ash and ruin. Mithrelas closed her eyes and centered her will, drawing upon the strength that flowed from the ring of adamant that adorned her finger. One of the 3 rings of the Eldar, wrought in secret and never touched by the Dark Lord's hand. The whispers grew fainter as her power rose to meet them, but still they persisted, gnawing at the edges of her consciousness like hungry wolves. You cannot hold me out forever, the voice continued, and now it carried a note of cruel amusement. I have all the time in the world, and my servants grow stronger with each passing day. Already they walk among your people, sowing discord and doubt. How long before your own guards turn their swords against you? How long before your king falls to an assassin's blade? You speak false words, wrapped in the guise of truth, Mithrelas replied aloud, her voice ringing clear in the stone chamber. Evil may seem to triumph for a season, but in the end it devours itself. This I have seen in the movements of the stars and the turning of the seasons. Laughter echoed from the Palantir, cold and mirthless as winter wind through dead leaves. The stone began to glow with a sickly light that had nothing to do with the magic placed within it by its makers. Images formed in its depths, visions of war and conquest, of cities burning and children weeping, of proud kings brought low and their crowns trampled in the mud. Look and see the fate of those who defy me, the voice commanded. Behold the price of your resistance. But Mithrelas was not so easily cowed. Drawing upon the power of her ring and the strength of will that had carried her through 3 ages of the world, she spoke a word of command in the ancient tongue of Valinor. The corrupt visions shattered like glass, replaced by images of her own choosing. The light of the 2 trees reflected in still waters. The music of the Ainur that shaped the world at its beginning. The faces of the Valar themselves gazing down in love and pity upon the children they had made. For a moment, the contest hung in balance. The power of darkness against the light of the undying lands, corruption against purity, despair against hope. Then, with a shriek of rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the tower, the presence withdrew from the Palantir, leaving it dark and silent as ordinary stone. Mithrelas slumped in her chair, drained by the effort of the struggle. The ring of adamant had grown warm upon her finger, its blue fire dimmed but not extinguished. She had won this battle, but she knew it was only the first of many to come. The necromancer had shown his hand, revealing both his power and his intent. War was coming to Ethermore, and it would be unlike any conflict the realm had ever known. Rising from her chair on unsteady legs, she made her way to the window that looked out over the city below. The sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of flames seen from afar. In the streets of Caer-Lumineth, people went about their evening business, merchants closing their shops, children playing in the squares, lovers walking hand in hand along the river. They seemed so innocent, so unaware of the shadow that was gathering to engulf them all. But even as she watched, she began to notice signs of the corruption that the necromancer had spoken of. A group of guardsmen stood in heated discussion, their voices raised in anger over some trifling matter. A merchant spat upon the ground as an old rival passed by, his face twisted with a hatred that seemed out of proportion to any earthly grievance. In the market square, a fight broke out between two traders who had been friends for 20 years, their dispute escalating with a speed and violence that spoke of influences beyond the natural. The whispers were indeed spreading, carried on the wind and in the water, seeping into the hearts of men like poison in the blood. How long before friend turned against friend, brother against brother, until the realm tore itself apart from within? A soft knock at the door interrupted her dark thoughts. "Enter," she called, and Captain Galador stepped into the chamber, his usually bright countenance grave with concern. "My lady," he said, bowing respectfully, "the king commands your presence in the great hall. The Council of Stars has been summoned, and there are developments that require your wisdom." Mithrelas nodded, gathering her robes about her. "What developments, Captain?" "Refugees, my lady. They come from the northern kingdoms, those that still stand. They bring word of armies on the march and cities fallen to shadow, and they speak of a great fortress rising in the east, where once there was only wasteland and ruin." The necromancer's words echoed in her memory. "My servants grow stronger with each passing day." It seemed the Dark Lord was moving more swiftly than even she had anticipated. The time for preparation was passing, and the hour of testing drew near. "I will come at once," she said, following Galador from the chamber. Behind them, the Palantir sat dark and silent upon its pedestal, but she could feel its presence like a weight upon her shoulders. The enemy had tasted her strength and found it formidable, but she knew he would return with greater force and subtler malice. The war for the soul of Middle-earth had begun in earnest, and the first battle would be fought not with sword and spear, but with hope and despair, faith and doubt, light and shadow. In that contest, victory would go not to the strongest army or the mightiest fortress, but to those who could hold fast to what was good and true when all around them crumbled into chaos. As she descended the winding stairs to the great hall below, Mithrelas offered a silent prayer to the powers of the West, asking for strength in the trials to come. For she sensed that the darkness ahead would test them all in ways they could not yet imagine, and only those who kept the light burning in their hearts would see the dawn. The great hall of Caer-Lumineth trembled as Erengala raised Alcarinque high above his head, the ancient blade blazing with white fire that drove back the shadows pressing against the windows. Around him, the Council of Stars had scattered in terror as darkness poured through the very stones of the fortress, bringing with it the stench of corruption and the whispers of the necromancer. "By the light of Arendil," the king cried, his voice ringing like a bell across the chaos, "I defy you, shadow of the void. No power of darkness shall claim dominion while the blood of the Star Touch flows in my veins." The darkness recoiled from his blade as if burned, writhing like a living thing as it sought to escape the cleansing fire. But even as it retreated, new shadows poured in to take its place, and the voice of the necromancer rose in cruel laughter that echoed from the very stones. "Brave words, little king," it whispered, "but your light grows dim, while mine waxes strong. Already my servants walk among your people, and doubt eats at their hearts like rust upon iron. How long can you stand alone against the tide of night?" Mithril stepped forward, the ring of adamant blazing blue upon her finger as she added her power to the king's. Where their lights touched, the shadows burned away like mist before the sun, but still more darkness pressed in from all sides, threatening to overwhelm them both. "We do not stand alone," she declared, her voice cutting through the necromancer's laughter. "The light of Valinor still shines in the west, and the powers who shape the world have not forgotten their children." As if summoned by her words, other lights began to kindle throughout the hall. Captain Galador drew his sword, its steel gleaming with silver fire. Old Círdan raised his staff, and the crystal at its tip blazed like a star. One by one, the members of the council found their courage and stood against the dark, their combined will pushing back the shadow until it howled in frustration. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two powers strove against each other, light and darkness, hope and despair, creation and the void. The very foundations of Caer Lumineth groaned under the strain, and cracks appeared in the ancient stones. Then, with a final shriek of rage, the darkness withdrew, pouring out through the windows and doors like smoke before a gale. The necromancer's voice faded to a whisper, then to silence, leaving only the sound of labored breathing and the crackle of dying flames. Erengala lowered his sword, its fire dimming but not extinguished. Around him, his counselors slowly picked themselves up from the floor, their faces pale but determined. They had faced the enemy's power directly and survived, though all could see the cost written in each other's eyes. "He grows stronger," Mithril said quietly, her ring dark once more upon her finger. "Each victory feeds his power, and each defeat only delays the inevitable. We cannot stand against him by force of arms alone." "Then what would you have us do?" asked Círdan, leaning heavily on his staff. "Flee across the sea and leave Middle-earth to its fate?" "No," the king said firmly. "We must fight, but not as he expects. The necromancer's greatest strength is also his weakness, his reliance on fear and despair. If we can kindle hope in the hearts of the free peoples, if we can unite them against the common threat, the old alliances are broken," Arador objected. "The northern kingdoms fall, the dwarves have sealed their halls, and the southern lords think only of their own domains. Who would answer such a call?" Erengala smiled grimly. "Sometimes the mightiest fortress falls to a pebble in the right place, and the greatest army is defeated by a single act of courage. We need not rally all the hosts of Middle-earth. We need only find those few who will stand when all seems lost." He moved to the great map that dominated the eastern wall, his finger tracing the roads that led away from Ethermoor toward distant lands. Send word to Thorek Ironbeard in the Blue Mountains. Tell him the shadow stirs, and the old oaths are remembered. Dispatch riders to the Shire folk in the Green Hills. They may seem small and insignificant, but their hearts are stout and their hands are skilled. And to the grey havens, where ships still sail west, perhaps the powers beyond the sea will send aid in our darkest hour. And what of us, my lord? Galador asked. What part do we play in this gathering storm? The king's eyes burned with a fire that had nothing to do with his sword's enchantment. We hold the line, Captain. Whatever comes, we hold the line until hope returns to the world, or the last star fails in the sky. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The darkness had retreated for now, but all who had witnessed its power knew it would return, stronger and more terrible than before. The war for Middle-earth had truly begun. In the circular chamber beneath the roots of the golden wood, where the mirror of Galadriel had shown the fates of ages past and yet to come, the White Council gathered in the grey hour before dawn. They came by secret ways and hidden paths, cloaked in shadow and silence, for the time of open meetings had passed and the enemy's eyes were everywhere. Saruman the White arrived first, his staff clicking on the stone as he paced the chamber's edge like a caged wolf. His face was grave beneath his pointed hood, but those with eyes to see might have noticed the glitter of something darker in his gaze. Ambition, perhaps, or the first seeds of doubt that would one day blossom into betrayal. Radagast, the brown, came from his halls in Rosgobel, leaves and twigs still tangled in his wild hair, his eyes bright with urgency. He spoke in whispers to the small creatures that accompanied him, mice and sparrows that had carried word across the wild lands of armies on the march and darkness spreading like a plague. Last came Gandalf, the Grey, leaning heavily on his staff, as if the weight of many sorrows burdened his shoulders. His usually bright eyes were dim with weariness, and those who knew him well could see that he bore tidings that would bring no comfort to the already troubled council. The necromancer moves openly now, he said, without preamble, settling his grey robes about him as he took his place in the circle. His fortress of Dol Guldur rises from the ruins of the Greenwood, and orcs gather there in numbers, not seen since the last alliance. The very trees flee from his presence, and the rivers run black with poison. Saruman's staff struck the floor with a sharp crack. We have debated this matter for too long already. The time for half measures and cautious counsel has passed. If we do not act now, the shadow will spread until no light remains in all of Middle-earth. And what would you have us do? Asked Elrond half-elven, his ageless face marked by centuries of sorrow. March upon Dol Guldur with all our might. The necromancer grows stronger with each passing day, feeding on the fear and despair of those who fall beneath his shadow. Better to strike while we still have strength, Saruman replied, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. Each day we delay, more kingdoms fall, more armies turn to his banner. Soon we will face not just orcs and wolves, but the very men we sought to protect. Galadriel, who had remained silent through this exchange, now spoke in her voice like silver water over stone. The White Wizard speaks truly, yet there is wisdom also in patience. The necromancer's power is great, but it is not yet complete. He seeks something, a weapon or talisman that will give him dominion over all the rings of power. "The One Ring," Gandalf said quietly, and at those words a chill fell over the chamber that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "It lies hidden still, but he searches for it with all his might. If he should find it—" The words hung unfinished in the air, for all present knew what the return of the Master Ring would mean. The free peoples of Middle-earth would face not just a powerful enemy, but one whose dominion over their very souls would be absolute. "Then we must find it first," Saruman declared, his eyes blazing with sudden intensity. "Surely between us we possess the wisdom and power to locate that which was lost. The Palantiri still show visions to those skilled in their use, and the old maps speak of places where such a thing might lie hidden." But Gandalf shook his head sadly. "It is not so simple, my friend. The ring chooses its own path, and its ways are hidden even from the wise. We might search for 1,000 years and never find it, or it might reveal itself tomorrow to the most unlikely of finders. Meanwhile, the enemy's power grows," Radagast interjected, his voice carrying the wild music of wind in the trees. "The greenwood sickens, and the creatures of the forest flee before a malice they cannot name. Even the great eagles speak of a darkness rising in the east that makes their ancient hearts afraid." The debate continued through the long hours of the morning, voices raised in argument and counsel, while outside the chamber the world turned slowly toward whatever fate awaited it. Some spoke of war, others of hiding, still others of seeking aid from the undying lands beyond the sea. But no clear path emerged from their deliberations, for the choices before them all led into shadow. At last, as the sun reached its zenith, Galadriel rose from her seat and moved to the center of the circle. In her hands, she bore a crystal vial filled with water from her mirror, and as she held it up to the light, visions began to dance within its depths. "Behold," she said, her voice carrying the authority of one who had looked upon the light of the two trees. "I show you what the mirror has revealed, not certainty, but possibility, the paths that might be taken if courage does not fail." In the water, they saw a small figure walking along a dusty road, his feet bare and his pack light upon his shoulders. He was neither tall nor strong, neither wise nor mighty, yet something in his bearing spoke of a strength that armies could not break, the simple courage of one who does what must be done, regardless of the cost. "A hobbit," Saruman said dismissively. What part could such a creature play in the great affairs of the world? But Gandalf leaned forward, his eyes bright with sudden understanding. "Perhaps the greatest part of all, my friend. For who would suspect such a one of bearing the hopes of all Middle-earth? The enemy seeks power and majesty, strength and dominion. He would not think to look for his doom in the Shire." "You speak in riddles," Elrond observed. "What is your meaning?" The grey wizard smiled for the first time in many days. "My meaning is this, that the smallest person can change the course of history if their heart is true and their purpose clear. The ring may indeed be found, but not by those who seek it for power or glory. It will come to one who desires it not, and by such a one it may yet be unmade." The vial in Galadriel's hands grew bright as starlight, and for a moment all present felt a lifting of their hearts, as if a great burden had been shared among them. The path ahead was still dark and uncertain, but they were no longer walking it alone. "Then let us place our hope in small things," Elrond said at last, "and let us prepare for the war that must come. whether the ring is found or not. For good or ill, the third age of Middle-earth draws toward its ending, and what comes after will depend upon the choices we make in the days ahead. As the White Council dispersed to their various realms and purposes, each carried with them the image of that small figure walking the dusty road. None yet knew his name or guessed his destiny, but in their hearts burned the hope that even in the darkest hour, light might yet prevail. The road to Erebor wound through valleys where autumn mist clung to the stones like the breath of sleeping dragons, and Gandalf, the grey, walked alone beneath skies that grew darker with each passing mile. His staff tapped steadily on the worn stones of the dwarf road, its sound echoing from the mountainsides like a drum calling the scattered to war. 3 days had passed since the White Council's meeting in the Golden Wood, and already the Grey Wizard could feel the weight of time pressing upon his shoulders. Each hour of delay brought the enemy closer to his goal. Each moment of indecision allowed the shadow to spread further across the lands of the free. But if his plan was to succeed, he would need allies whose courage was matched only by their pride, and few in Middle-earth were more proud than the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain. The great gates of Erebor rose before him like the entrance to another world, their stone carved with runes that spoke of glory and gold, of battles won and treasures claimed. But the guards who challenged him at the threshold bore faces marked by worry, and their axes gleamed with the sharpness of weapons too often drawn. "State your business, wizard," growled the captain of the gate guard, his beard braided with iron rings that clinked as he spoke. "These are dark times, and King Thoric sees no visitors without good cause." "My cause is the darkest of all," Gandalf replied, lowering his hood to reveal eyes that held the weight of ages. "I bring word of shadows stirring in the east, and of alliances that must be forged if any of us are to see another spring." The dwarf's expression softened slightly at the wizard's words, for even the mountain folk had heard rumors of strange happenings in the outer world. He led Gandalf through halls carved from living rock, where the light of forge fires danced on walls adorned with tapestries depicting the great deeds of dwarf kings past. King Thorek Ironbeard sat upon his throne of carved stone, his great axe leaning against his knee and his crown glinting in the firelight. He was younger than his predecessor, barely a century old by dwarf reckoning, but his eyes held the wisdom of one who had seen his people through many trials. "Gandalf Greyheim," he said, rising to greet his visitor with the respect due to an old friend. "Your coming is unexpected but not unwelcome. What news do you bring from the world beyond our gates?" "Dark news, I fear," the wizard replied, settling his grey robes about him as he took the offered seat. "The necromancer has revealed himself at last, and his power grows with each passing day. Already the northern kingdoms fall before his armies, and those who might have stood against him either bend the knee or face destruction." Thorek's knuckles whitened as his grip tightened on his axe handle. "And what would you have the dwarves do about it? Our halls are strong, our weapons sharp, our hearts stout. Let the necromancer come. He will find Erebor a harder nut to crack than the kingdoms of men." "Your mountain may indeed prove impregnable," Gandalf agreed, "but what of the world beyond? If all the free peoples fall to shadow, how long can even the mightiest fortress stand alone? The enemy's patience is as vast as his malice, and he can afford to wait while you slowly starve behind your stone walls." The Dwarf King was silent for a long moment, his weathered face creased in thought. Around them, the great hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for words that might change the fate of nations. "Speak plainly, wizard," Thorek said at last. "What is it you ask of us?" "I ask for something more precious than gold or mithril," Gandalf replied. "I ask for hope. There are signs and portents that speak of a quest to come, a journey that will require courage beyond measure and hearts that do not easily despair. The Dwarves have ever been a people of determination and honor. In the dark days ahead, such qualities may prove more valuable than all the treasure in your mountain." "A quest?" The king leaned forward, interest flickering in his eyes. What manner of quest would require the aid of Durin's folk? Gandalf smiled, but there was sadness in it. "That remains to be seen. But I sense that before this tale is told, the courage of small folk will prove mightier than the strength of armies. When that time comes, they will need guides who know the secret ways of the world, warriors who will not flinch from danger, friends who will stand by them whatever the cost." "The Dwarves have never been known for abandoning friends in need," Thorek said proudly. "If such a quest is indeed fated, you may count on our aid, for the right cause and the right companions." "Then I ask one thing more," the wizard said, rising from his chair. "In the halls beneath this mountain lie maps and lore from the elder days, knowledge that may prove crucial in the trials to come. I would study them with your permission and perhaps divine something of the paths that lie ahead." The Dwarf King nodded slowly. "The archives are yours to explore, old friend. But beware, some knowledge carries a price, and the weight of prophecy can crush even the strongest shoulders." As Gandalf made his way to the deep halls where the ancient wisdom of the dwarves lay preserved in stone and parchment, he could not help but feel that time itself was quickening around him. Somewhere in the Shire, a small figure was living out his quiet days, unaware that the fate of the world might soon rest in his unlikely hands. In the east, the shadow grew stronger with each passing hour, gathering its forces for a war that would decide the destiny of all Middle-earth. But here, in the halls of Erebor, surrounded by the strength and loyalty of the mountain folk, the Grey Wizard allowed himself a moment of hope. The pieces were beginning to move on the great board, and though the outcome was far from certain, at least the game had begun. The road ahead would be long and dark, but they would not walk it alone. In the green heart of the Shire, where the rivers ran clear and the hedgerows bloomed with flowers that had no names in the tongues of larger folk, Bilbo Baggins of Bag End sat smoking his pipe on the bench before his round green door. The autumn sun cast long shadows across his well-tended garden, and the smoke from his pipe curled lazily upward to join the white clouds that drifted across the peaceful sky. To any observer, he would have seemed the very picture of hobbit contentment, a prosperous bachelor of middle years, well-fed and well-dressed, with no greater concern than the state of his tomatoes or the quality of his afternoon tea. But those with keener eyes might have noticed something different about this particular hobbit, a restlessness that sat strangely on his comfortable shoulders, a distant look that spoke of memories both wonderful and terrible. For Bilbo, Baggins had walked roads that led far from the Shire's green borders, had seen mountains that touched the sky and dragons that hoarded gold like autumn leaves. He had stood in the halls of the Elven King and witnessed the fury of the king under the mountain. Most importantly of all, though he spoke of this to no living soul, he had found something in the darkness beneath the Misty Mountains, something that lay even now in a locked drawer of his study, wrapped in silk and shadow. The sound of a walking stick tapping on the garden path drew him from his reverie, and he looked up to see a familiar grey-cloaked figure approaching through the evening mist. Gandalf the Grey walked as if weighted down by sorrows, too heavy for mortal shoulders to bear, but his eyes still held the bright fire that had first drawn a timid hobbit from his comfortable hole so many years before. "Good evening, Bilbo," the wizard said, settling his tall frame onto the bench beside his old friend. "I trust you are well." "As well as can be expected," Bilbo replied, though his voice carried an odd note of strain. "The Shire keeps its own troubles at bay, but even here we hear whispers of dark doings in the wide world. The elves who pass through on their way to the Grey Havens speak of shadows stirring, and the dwarves who come down from the Blue Mountains carry axes sharper than any harvest time requires." Gandalf nodded gravely, accepting the offered pipe tobacco with hands that trembled slightly with weariness. "The shadows you speak of are real, my dear fellow, and they grow longer with each passing day. I fear the time of peace the Shire has known may soon come to an end." "I had hoped never to hear such words again," Bilbo said quietly, his fingers unconsciously moving to touch something in his waistcoat pocket. "I have had my share of adventures, Gandalf. Surely there are younger folk better suited to whatever dark business you have in mind." "Youth is not always the answer to the world's problems," the wizard replied, studying his companion's face in the fading light. "Sometimes it is experience that matters most, the knowledge of what it means to face the darkness and emerge with one's soul intact. You have that knowledge, Bilbo, bought with trials that would have broken lesser spirits." The hobbit was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. "I was younger then, and perhaps more foolish. The thought of adventure seemed exciting rather than terrifying. Now I know the true cost of such enterprises, the friends lost, the innocents sacrificed, the weight of choices that echo through all the years that follow." "And yet you survived," Gandalf observed. "More than survived. You returned home with treasures beyond gold or silver. You learned that even the smallest person can change the course of history if their heart is in the right place." Bilbo's hand moved again to his pocket, and this time Gandalf's keen eyes caught the gesture. For just a moment, the wizard's expression sharpened with interest, but he said nothing of what he suspected lay hidden there. "I have been having the strangest dreams of late," Bilbo continued, seemingly unaware of his companion's scrutiny. "Dreams of fire and shadow, of a great eye searching the world for something precious and lost. I wake with the taste of ash in my mouth and a feeling that time itself is running short." "Dreams can be powerful things," Gandalf said carefully, "especially for those who have touched the deep magics of the world, however briefly. Perhaps your spirit senses what your mind has not yet grasped, that the quiet days are ending, and a new chapter of the world's tale is about to begin." The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and clear above the western horizon. In its light, both hobbit and wizard seemed suddenly older, marked by the weight of years and the burden of knowledge that brought no comfort. "If such dark times are indeed coming," Bilbo said at last, "what part would you have me play? I am no warrior, no great lord with armies at my command. I am only a hobbit of the Shire, content with my books and my garden and my second breakfast." Gandalf smiled, and for a moment his face held something of the brightness it had shown in happier days. "Sometimes, my dear Bilbo, that is exactly what the world needs most. Not another warrior or lord, but someone who remembers what is worth fighting for. Your role in the days ahead may be smaller than you imagine, or greater than you dare to hope. But I suspect it will be exactly what it needs to be when the time comes for it to be played." They sat in companionable silence as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, each lost in thoughts of the road ahead. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing, its voice sweet and clear in the evening air. It was a sound of peace and home, of simple joys that asked nothing more than to be appreciated. "Promise me one thing, Gandalf," Bilbo said as the wizard rose to continue his journey. "Whatever comes, whatever dark purposes may be brewing in the wide world, remember that the Shire exists as a reminder of what we fight to preserve. Not all battles are won with swords and spears. Some are won by simply refusing to let the darkness extinguish the light of ordinary kindness." "I will remember," the wizard promised, his voice soft with affection for the small figure silhouetted against the lighted doorway. "And perhaps, when the final accounting is made, that will prove to be the most important victory of all." As Gandalf disappeared into the night, walking the ancient paths that led away from the Shire toward larger and more dangerous concerns, Bilbo stood for a long time in his doorway. In his pocket, something small and precious seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if responding to the wizard's presence with a will that was not entirely its own. But of this, the hobbit spoke to no one, not even in the pages of the Red Book, where he recorded his most private thoughts. Some secrets, he had learned, were too dangerous to share, even with oneself. The paths that wound through the Misty Mountains had grown treacherous with more than stone and snow. Gil-galad rode with but a handful of his most trusted knights, their horses' breath misting in the thin air as they climbed toward the hidden halls of Khazad-dûm. The very rocks seemed to whisper of ancient grudges and forgotten oaths, and more than once the elven king paused to listen to sounds that were not quite wind, not quite voice. "My lord," spoke Elrond, riding at his right hand. "The dwarves have grown silent in their mountain halls. Even the traders who once came singing down the mithril speak now in hushed tones of lights that should not be, and hammers that ring with no hand to guide them." Gil-galad nodded, his grey eyes fixed upon the path ahead, where the great gates of Durin's folk lay hidden behind veils of mist and time. "Durin's bane stirs in the deep places," he said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "Yet it is not alone in its awakening. The shadow reaches out with many hands, seeking to grasp what it cannot understand, to corrupt what it cannot create." The wind howled through the peaks above them, and in its voice Gil-galad heard the echo of hammers long stilled, of songs cut short in darkness. The dwarves had delved too deep in their greed for mithril, and now something ancient and terrible walked their halls. Yet still they must be warned. Still they must be offered the choice between courage and despair. When at last they reached the great doors of Moria, wrought with Ithildin that caught the starlight like captured songs, Gil-galad placed his hand upon the stone and spoke the ancient words of friendship. The doors opened slowly, as if reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. And from within came the sound of many feet, heavily armed and bearing the scent of deep places where no light had ever shone. Durin the Sixth emerged from the shadows of his realm, his beard white as mountain snow, his eyes bright with the fire that burns in the hearts of his people. Yet Gil-galad saw in those eyes the shadow of fear, the knowledge of something vast and hungry stirring in the roots of the mountain. Gil-galad Erinion, the Dwarf King spoke, his voice echoing in the vast chamber behind him. Long has it been since the Elven kings walked the paths to our doors. What brings you to Khazad-dûm in these darkening days? The same shadow that troubles your sleep, Durin, king under the mountain, Gil-galad replied, dismounting from his horse and approaching with hands open in the gesture of peace. Evil wakes in many places, and those who would stand against it must stand together, else we shall fall as scattered leaves before the storm. The Dwarf King's eyes grew troubled, and he glanced back into the depths of his realm, where the sound of hammers had grown strange and irregular, as if fear guided the hands that wielded them. We have heard the call of deep places, he said slowly. Ancient things stir that were better left sleeping. Our miners speak of voices in the dark, of flames that burn without fuel. Then you know why I have come, Gil-galad said. The time of choosing draws near, when all the free peoples must decide whether they will fade quietly into the darkness or kindle what light they can against the coming night. And in the depths of Moria, something roared with a voice like the breaking of the world. Far from the troubled halls of Durin's folk and the shadow-haunted towers of Gil-galad's realm, there lay a land so green and peaceful that it seemed the very heart of spring had made its dwelling there. The Shire drowsed in eternal afternoon, its rolling hills dotted with hobbit holes that opened like flowers toward the sun, their round doors painted in cheerful yellows and greens and blues that spoke of simple joys and contentment with small things. In the village of Hobbiton, where the mill wheel turned lazily beside the water and the smoke from a dozen chimneys rose straight up in the still air, there lived a hobbit of middle years whose pantry was always full and whose doorstep was always clean. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End was accounted a respectable hobbit by his neighbours, though some whispered that he had inherited a touch of the Tookish wildness from his mother's side and was perhaps a bit too fond of books and maps and tales of far-off places. On this particular morning, as Gil-galad rode the mountain paths and spoke of war with dwarf kings, Bilbo sat in his garden with a cup of tea growing cold in his hands, staring eastward over the hedgerows toward lands he had never seen. There was a restlessness in him of late, a stirring that made his comfortable hobbit hole seem suddenly small and stuffy, his well-ordered life a cage of his own making. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things, adventures, he murmured to himself, repeating the words he had spoken to visitors who came asking for such foolishness. Yet even as he said them, his heart beat a little faster, and his eyes lingered on the horizon, where the Misty Mountains rose like distant dreams. The wind that stirred the leaves of the party tree carried whispers from far away, though Bilbo could not have said what they spoke of. There was a taste of change upon it, of great deeds and long roads, of dragons sleeping on hoards of gold, and wizards walking paths that led beyond the edge of all maps. He shivered despite the warmth of the sun, and found himself thinking of his great-great-great-granduncle, Bull Roarer Took, who had ridden to battle and won a great victory at the Battle of Green Fields. "Adventure," he said again, but this time the word did not sound quite so distasteful. "Nasty things, adventures, make you late for dinner. I don't know what came over me." Yet he did not go inside, but sat watching the eastern sky as if expecting to see something wonderful and terrible come walking over the hills. In his blood, perhaps, ran some echo of the wandering madness that had seized his ancestors, the call of far horizons and untrodden paths. In the distance, a raven cawed 3 times and took wing toward the mountains, and Bilbo Baggins felt his heart leap like a salmon in the spring floods, though he could not have said why. He was, after all, a respectable hobbit of Bag End, with a perfectly good hobbit hole and a perfectly comfortable life, and no need whatsoever of adventures or anything of the sort. But the wind kept blowing from the east, and in it were voices that spoke of kings and dragons, of deep places where shadows walked, and of small hands that might yet turn the wheel of fate. And Bilbo Baggins sat in his garden until the stars came out, listening to whispers he did not understand, feeling the first stirrings of a destiny he could not imagine. The Shire slept, but some dreams, once begun, are not easily set aside. In the hidden valley of Rivendell, where time flowed differently, and the music of water over stone sang eternally of peace and rest, Elrond Half-Elven stood before the great map that adorned the eastern wall of his study. The ancient parchment showed Middle-earth as it had been in the elder days, when the kingdoms of men were young and the power of the Eldar still burned bright in the western lands. But now, as his ageless fingers traced the paths that led from the Misty Mountains to the Lonely Mountain and beyond, his thoughts were not of the past, but of the perilous future that rushed toward them like a tide of shadow. Gandalf's message had arrived that morning, carried by one of the great eagles whose eyes could pierce the veils of distance and deception. The words it bore were few but heavy with import. The pieces are in motion. The time of choosing draws near. A soft footfall on the marble floor announced the arrival of another, and Elrond turned to see his daughter Arwen approaching, her dark hair gleaming like starlight in the lampglow. Her face bore the timeless beauty of the Eldar, but her eyes held a sorrow that spoke of visions glimpsed in dream and waking alike. "Father," she said, her voice musical as the sound of silver bells in the wind, "I have looked into the mirror of memory and seen again the paths that branch before us. All led into darkness, but some offer hope where others promise only despair." "What have you seen, my daughter?" Elrond asked, though his heart already trembled to know the answer. "I have seen a small company walking ancient roads, their feet turned toward the heart of shadow itself. Some will fall before the journey's end, and others will be changed beyond all recognition. But if they hold true to their purpose, if courage does not fail in the darkest hour, then perhaps the light will not go out of the world entirely." The Elf Lord nodded slowly, his wise eyes reflecting the weight of decisions that would echo through the ages. Gandalf speaks truly when he says that great events often turn on small hinges. The mightiest army may be defeated by a moment's hesitation, while a single act of courage can topple kingdoms. "But at such a cost," Arwen whispered, her hand moving to rest over her heart. "The price of victory may be higher than any of us dare imagine. Those who walk this path will carry scars that no healing art can mend, and some will never return to the lands they fought to save. Yet if they do not walk it, all will be lost regardless, her father replied. Better to pay a great price for hope than a small one for despair. The choice is made, daughter. Now we must trust in the wisdom of the one who set the music of creation in motion, and in the strength of simple hearts that choose to do what is right rather than what is easy. Far to the north, in the halls beneath Erebor, Thoric Ironbeard sat in council with his most trusted advisors, their bearded faces grave in the firelight as they discussed the strange request that had come from the Grey Wizard. Maps lay spread across the stone table, showing the secret paths that wound through the Misty Mountains and the wild lands beyond. It is a fool's errand, grumbled Balin the Old, his white beard bristling with indignation. What business have we sending good dwarves on some mad quest dreamed up by a wizard? Our strength lies in our mountains, our axes, our gold. Let the tall folk fight their own battles. The wizard saved our people once before, Thorek reminded him, his voice carrying the authority of kingship. When the dragon Smaug threatened to devour all the north, it was Gandalf who found the key to our salvation. Perhaps he sees a path now that our eyes cannot follow. Or perhaps he leads us to destruction, muttered Dwalin the Grim, his scarred hands clenched around his axe handle. The enemy grows stronger while we debate, and already his shadow falls upon lands that once knew peace. How long before it reaches even these halls? All the more reason to act while we still can, the king replied. If there is indeed a quest to come that requires our aid, then by Durin's beard we shall provide it. The dwarves have never been ones to abandon friends in their hour of need. The debate continued long into the night, voices raised in argument and counsel, while the forge fires burned low and the mountain itself seemed to listen with stone ears. But in the end, the decision was made as Thorek had known it would be. The dwarves would honor their ancient oaths of friendship, whatever the cost. And in the distant Shire, Bilbo Baggins sat in his study writing by candlelight, his pen scratching across the pages of his journal as he set down the story of his great adventure so many years before. But now the tale seemed different somehow, charged with new meaning and hidden significance. The dragon's gold, the riddles in the dark, the finding of a certain golden ring, all of it felt like preparation for something greater, a prologue to a story whose true climax lay yet ahead. He paused in his writing, his hand moving unconsciously to his pocket, where that same ring lay wrapped in silk and shadow. For a moment, it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if aware of his thoughts and eager to be acknowledged. But Bilbo shook his head and returned to his writing, pushing aside the strange fancies that had troubled him since Gandalf's visit. Outside his window, the night wind sighed through the trees of the Shire, carrying on it the scent of change and the whisper of roads that led beyond the borders of all safe and comfortable things. Somewhere in the darkness, destiny was stirring, and the time of quiet days was drawing to its close. The great wheel of time turned onward toward whatever fate awaited, and all the free peoples of Middle-earth, whether they knew it or not, held their breath for the dawn that would herald either their salvation or their doom. Deep beneath the lonely mountain, in chambers carved from living rock where the treasure hoards of dragon kings lay gleaming, in the torchlight, something stirred that had slept for decades in the darkness, Smaug the Mighty, last of the great fire drakes of the north, opened one enormous eye and felt the tremor of change ripple through his ancient bones. For 60 years he had lain coiled upon his bed of gold, dreaming the slow dreams of dragonkind, while the world above turned through its seasons of peace and war. But now, those dreams were troubled by whispers from the east, by a voice that spoke in the black speech of powers that remembered the elder days when dragons served a master darker than night itself. "Awake, child of fire," the voice whispered, sliding through his consciousness like smoke through a keyhole. "The time of hiding is ended. Your master calls, and the ancient compact must be honored." Smaug raised his great head, flames flickering between his teeth as he tested the air with senses keener than those of any living thing. The scent that reached him was complex. Fear and greed, ambition and despair, all mingled with the copper tang of blood and the acrid smoke of distant burning. Somewhere beyond the mountain's roots, armies were gathering, and the taste of war hung heavy in the darkness. "I serve no master," the dragon rumbled, his voice like the grinding of millstones in the depths of the earth. "I am Smaug the impenetrable, Smaug the unassailable, Smaug the mighty. The treasures of Erebor are mine by right of conquest, and I share them with none." But even as he spoke these words of defiance, he felt the ancient bindings stir within his spirit. Chains forged in the dark years when Morgoth, the enemy, first brought dragons into being, commanding their loyalty with arts that made mockery of free will. The voice that called to him now carried echoes of that primal authority, and though he fought against it with all his pride and fury, he could feel his resistance weakening like ice before the spring sun. "You are bound to me by blood and fire," the voice continued, and now it carried a note of cruel amusement. "Your very existence is a gift from the Dark Throne, and that gift can be reclaimed at will. Serve willingly, and you shall have treasures beyond imagining. Resist, and learn what it means to face the wrath of your creator." The great dragon writhed upon his golden bed, his tail lashing out to scatter coins and gems like a shower of deadly rain. His roar of rage echoed through the mountain's depths, shaking the very foundations and causing avalanches in the passes far above. But for all his fury, he could not break free from the bonds that held his spirit in thrall. In the halls above, King Thorek felt the mountain tremble beneath his feet and knew with a chill of terror that the ancient menace had awakened. For 2 generations, the dwarves had lived in the shadow of the sleeping dragon, always aware that their prosperity existed only at his sufferance. Now that balance of power was shifting, and the consequences would be felt far beyond the boundaries of Erebor. "Seal the lower passages," he commanded his guards, though he knew such measures would provide little protection against a creature that could melt stone with his breath. "Double the watch on all entrances and send word to our kin in the Iron Hills. If Smaug means to fly again, we must be ready to evacuate the mountain." But even as his orders were carried out with dwarvish efficiency, Thorek knew in his heart that running would not save them. If the dragon had indeed awakened to serve some darker purpose, then nowhere in Middle-earth would be safe from his wrath. Far below, Smaug lay still once more, but his stillness was not that of sleep. His great mind, cunning beyond the measure of mortal understanding, wrestled with the compulsion that sought to bend him to another's will. He had been free for so long that the taste of servitude was bitter as wormwood on his forked tongue. Yet as the hours passed and the voice continued its insidious whispers, he began to see possibilities that his pride had initially rejected. If the Dark Lord was indeed returning to power, then alliance with him might prove more profitable than resistance. The treasures of one mountain, however vast, were nothing compared to the wealth of entire kingdoms laid waste by dragonfire. "Show me," he said at last, his voice heavy with reluctant surrender. "Show me what you offer, and I will consider your bargain." The response came not in words, but in visions that filled his mind like poisonous wine poured into a golden cup. He saw armies marching under banners of black and red, their ranks filled with orcs and wolves and creatures whose names were spoken only in nightmares. He saw cities burning and treasure vaults thrown open to his desire. Most tempting of all, he saw other dragons, his long-lost kindred, thought extinct since the War of Wrath, rising from their hidden lairs to reclaim the skies. "All this can be yours," the voice promised, "if you will but serve the returning king. Fly forth from your mountain prison and let the world remember why dragons were feared in the elder days. Your fire shall be the herald of the new age, your roar the announcement of the Dark Lord's return." Smaug's eyes blazed like furnaces as he considered the offer. His pride warred with his greed, his love of independence with his desire for greater treasures than he had ever imagined. In the end, it was neither pride nor greed that decided him, but something deeper and more terrible, the loneliness of ages spent in solitude, the hunger for companionship among his own kind. "I will serve," he said, and the words fell from his lips like drops of molten gold. "But know this, Lord of the East, my loyalty is bought, not given freely. Betray me, and you will learn why dragons trust no one, not even their creators." The laughter that answered him was cold as winter wind and sharp as broken glass. "Betrayal is for those who have choices, my pet. You have none." As the compulsion settled over him like a cloak of shadow and flame, Smaug began to move with purpose for the first time in decades. His great body uncoiled from the treasure hoard, coins and gems cascading from his scales like a waterfall of light. He stretched his wings, membranes of leather and bone that could blot out the sun, and felt the ancient joy of preparation for flight coursing through his veins. Soon he would burst forth from the mountain's heart like a star falling upward into the sky. Soon the people of Lake Town and Dale would look up from their daily labors to see death approaching on wings of fire. And in the east, his new master would smile to know that the first piece of his grand design had fallen into place. The age of dragons was about to begin anew, and the world would burn before it was finished. But in the deep places of his draconic heart, beneath the compulsion and the promise of treasure, Smaug the Mighty nurtured a small flame of his own, not the fire of destruction, but the ember of revenge. His service would be given as promised, but when the time came for reckoning, the Dark Lord would learn that even bound dragons had claws. In the forges of Dol Guldur, where the air shimmered with heat that had nothing to do with honest fire, the Nazgul Lord, known as the Witch King, bent over his work with the patience of one who had all eternity to perfect his craft. Before him on the anvil lay a blade unlike any forged since the breaking of the world, not made of steel or iron, but of shadow given form, darkness hammered into the shape of death itself. Each strike of his hammer sent ripples of malice through the air, and the very stones of the fortress wept black tears at the touch of such concentrated evil. For this was no ordinary weapon being born in the hellish forge, but an instrument of the Dark Lord's will, shaped to serve purposes that would make the bravest hearts fail and the strongest walls crumble to dust. "Master," came a voice from the shadows, soft as silk and sharp as broken glass. The mouth of Sauron emerged from the darkness, his face hidden behind a mask of black steel that reflected the forge light like a mirror of despair. "The preparations proceed as you commanded. The armies gather in the eastern wastes, and the dragon stirs beneath his mountain of gold." The Witch King did not pause in his hammering, each blow precise and measured as the tolling of funeral bells. "And what of the western lands? Do the fools still debate and dither while their doom approaches?" "They know not what they face," the mouth replied, his voice carrying the cruel satisfaction of one who has watched hope die in the eyes of the innocent. "Their councils meet in secret, their messengers ride the hidden paths, but they see only fragments of the design. They prepare for the war they understand, not the one that comes." "Good." The Witch King raised his hammer for another strike, and for a moment the darkness around him seemed to deepen, as if all light fled from his presence. "Let them cling to their illusions of honor and nobility. When the true nature of our assault is revealed, their despair will be all the sweeter." The blade on the anvil pulsed with its own malevolent life, drinking in the hatred and fear that surrounded it like a thirsty man drinks water. Its edge was sharper than any mortal weapon, capable of cutting through armor and bone as easily as silk. But its true power lay not in its sharpness, but in its hunger. For this was a blade that fed on the life force of those it slew, growing stronger with each drop of blood it spilled. "What name will you give it, Lord?" the mouth asked, his masked face turning toward the weapon with something approaching reverence. "It needs no name," the Witch King replied, his voice echoing strangely in the confines of the forge. "It is not meant to be remembered in song or story, but to end them. When its work is done, there will be none left to speak its deeds, and silence will cover the world like a shroud." As if in response to his words, the blade gave a final pulse of dark radiance and lay still upon the anvil, its forging complete. The Witch King lifted it with hands that had once been mortal, but now knew only the touch of shadow, testing its balance and weight with the skill of a master swordsman. "Perfect," he whispered, and there was something almost tender in his voice, the way a father might speak of a beloved child. "With this blade, I shall cut the heart from their resistance and watch their light fail forever." But even as he spoke these words of doom, far to the west, another blade stirred in its sheath, a sword forged in the dawn of the world, when the music of creation still echoed in the halls of Valinor. Sting lay sleeping in Bag End, wrapped in silk and leather, waiting for the hand that would draw it in the service of light. Between these two weapons, one born of shadow and malice, the other wrought in hope and starfire, lay the fate of Middle-earth itself. They were destined to meet in battle, though none yet knew when or where that meeting would come. One would drink deep of darkness and grow strong on despair, while the other would blaze with the memory of the undying lands and the courage of simple folk. The Witch King sheathed his new blade in a scabbard of black leather bound with silver wire, each strand inscribed with runes that hurt the eyes to look upon. As he did so, the temperature in the forge seemed to drop by degrees, until even the furnace fires burned low and the very air grew thick with winter's chill. "Send word to the outposts," he commanded, turning away from the anvil toward the window that looked out over the wasteland of Dol Guldur. "The time of preparation draws to its close. Soon we shall march, and the world will tremble at our coming." The mouth bowed deeply and withdrew, leaving the Nazgul Lord alone with his thoughts and his terrible blade. Outside the window, the landscape stretched away toward the horizon, a realm of ash and thorn where nothing good could grow, where the very earth had been poisoned by centuries of evil dwelling upon it. But it would not always be thus. When his master's victory was complete, when the last of the free peoples had knelt or died, this wasteland would spread to cover all the world. The green fields of Rohan would wither and die. The gardens of Lothlorien would choke on poisonous air, and even the Shire would know the taste of ash and despair. The Witch King smiled beneath his hood, though it was not a smile that any living thing would recognize as such. Soon the blade at his side would taste blood, and the world would learn what it meant to face the servants of the Dark Lord when they came not as raiders or scouts, but as conquerors. Yet in his moment of dark triumph, he felt a strange stirring in the depths of his being, a flicker of something that might once have been doubt, or even fear. For though he served a master whose power seemed limitless, he remembered the days when the light had not yet failed, when the heroes walked the earth and hope was more than just a word. Those days were long past, buried beneath centuries of shadow and sorrow. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between battles, he wondered if the light might yet return to challenge the darkness he served so faithfully. The thought was weakness, he knew, and he crushed it ruthlessly before it could take root. There was no place for doubt in the service of the Dark Lord, no room for mercy or regret. He was the Witch King of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgul, the shadow that fell before the storm, and his blade thirsted for the blood of the innocent. In the deep vaults beneath the lonely mountain, where the gold of kings lay heaped in glittering drifts, and the air hung thick with the scent of avarice and ancient pride, something stirred that had slept for 60 years in the darkness. Smaug the mighty, Smaug the impenetrable, Smaug the unassailable, opened one great eye like a star of malice in the black depths of Erebor. The dragon had dreamed, as dragons do, of fire and conquest, of the taste of man-flesh and the screams of the dying. But these dreams had been different, touched with whispers from the east, with promises of power and dominion that made even his vast hoard seem small and tarnished. In the depths of sleep, he had heard the voice of one who called himself master of all the world, who spoke of alliance and shared conquest. Now, as consciousness returned like flame creeping through dry timber, Smaug stretched his mighty coils and felt the gold shift and cascade around him like water. Each coin bore the mark of Durin's folk. Each cup and crown spoke of the kingdom that had been, and the dragon's heart swelled with fierce joy at the memory of fire and death, of the day when he had come down from the north like a hurricane of destruction. 60 years, he rumbled, his voice echoing in the vast chamber like the grinding of millstones. 60 years I have slept, and still they have not dared to challenge me. Where are the warriors of old? Where are the heroes with their bright swords and their foolish songs? But even as he spoke, his keen senses caught something that had not been there when he laid himself down to sleep. There was a taste upon the air, bitter and cold, that spoke of movements in the world above, of powers stirring that had long lain dormant. From the east came whispers that made his scales prickle with anticipation, promises of greater wars to come, of alliance with forces that could sweep the free peoples into the sea. The dragon raised his great head, and his eyes burned like furnaces in the darkness. He could feel it now, the touch of the necromancer's will reaching out from his fortress in the south of Mirkwood, seeking allies among all the creatures of malice and greed. Here was one who understood the language of fire and conquest, who offered not servitude, but partnership in dominion. Sauron, Smaug whispered, tasting the name like wine upon his forked tongue. Yes, I remember thee from the old days, Sauron the Deceiver, Sauron the Great. And thou rememberest me, it seems. What wouldst thou have of Smaug the Mighty? The answer came not in words, but in visions that filled the dragon's mind like poison honey. He saw armies marching beneath banners of black and red, saw cities burning and kingdoms falling like wheat before the scythe. He saw himself flying at the head of a host of winged shapes, breathing fire upon lands that had never known fear. But more than this, he saw purpose. For too long, he had been merely a guardian of gold, a watchdog sleeping upon his hoard. Now there was offered to him a chance to be what he had always been meant to be, a force of destruction, a bringer of endings, a dragon in the fullness of his terrible glory. Smaug the Golden rose from his bed of treasure, and his wings stirred the air of the mountain until the very stones groaned with the pressure. Gold cascaded from his scales like a waterfall of light, and his eyes burned with fires that had not blazed so bright since the day he destroyed the city of Dale. Yes, he hissed, and his voice was the sound of kingdoms falling. Let the world remember why dragons were feared. Let them remember the fire of Smaug. In the halls above, the wind howled through empty corridors where Dwarven voices had once raised songs of making and mining. But now there was only silence and the deep, rhythmic breathing of something vast and terrible that had decided to wake. In the depths of Dol Guldur, where the trees grew black and twisted and no bird dared to sing, the necromancer stood upon the highest tower of his fortress and gazed out over the canopy of Mirkwood with eyes that burned like coals in the darkness. The shape he wore was fair to look upon, tall and noble as the memory of ancient kings, but there was a wrongness about it that made the very air shrink away from his presence. Sauron, for that was his true name, though few now dared to speak it, felt the stirring of his servants across the wide world. From the north came the heat of dragonfire as Smaug woke to his calling. From the deep places beneath the mountains came the roar of things that had never seen the light of the sun. And from the south, from the hidden places where his most faithful servants dwelt in exile, came whispers of armies gathering in secret, of forges working day and night to arm the hosts of darkness. But it was not yet time. Not yet. The wise still walked the world, and their eyes were keen and their hearts stout. Gil-galad held court in Lindon, and his spear Aeglos had not forgotten the taste of orc blood. Elrond kept watch in Rivendell, and his house was a sanctuary that even the shadow could not easily breach. And in the grey havens, Círdan the shipwright still built vessels for those who would take the straight road oversea, carrying hope and memory beyond the circles of the world. Yet for all their watchfulness, they could not be everywhere at once. Already the paths through Mirkwood grew dark and perilous, haunted by spiders that spun webs like nets of malice, by wolves whose eyes gleamed with unnatural cunning. The woodland realm of Thranduil had withdrawn behind its barriers of enchantment, and fewer were the songs that rose from the halls of the Elven King. Sauron smiled, and his smile was like the glint of moonlight on a naked blade. Soon, perhaps, it would be time to test their strength. Soon the world would learn that the Dark Lord had not passed away with the breaking of Thangorodrim, that his malice was deathless and his reach long. But first, there were preparations to be made. In the pits beneath his fortress, his servants labored at forges that burned with no wholesome fire, shaping weapons and armor for the armies that would one day march forth to reclaim what he accounted his by right. Not for him the crude work of orcs and goblins, though they too had their place in his designs. These were works of subtlety and craft, rings and amulets and blades that carried within them a portion of his will, seeds of corruption that would take root wherever they were born. He raised his hand, and upon his finger gleamed a band of gold that seemed to drink in all light and give back only darkness. The One Ring, the master of all the rings of power, forged in the fires of Mount Doom, with all his malice and his will. Through it, he could reach out across the wide world and touch the minds of those who bore the lesser rings, could whisper in their thoughts and turn their purposes to his own. But the ring was not yet fully his to command. Somewhere in Middle-earth, he knew not where, lay the 7 and the 9, scattered and hidden by those who had discovered too late the trap that had been laid for them. And the 3, the 3 rings of the elves, made in secret without his touch, yet still bound to the one by the spells that had been woven into their making. Those he desired above all others, for they were mighty beyond the measure of their making, and in the hands of the wise they were a power that even he could not lightly dismiss. Time. All he needed was time, and the patience that was the gift of his immortal nature. Let Gil-galad and his kind believe that the shadow had retreated, that the defeat of Morgoth had broken forever the power of darkness in Middle-earth. Let them grow complacent in their halls of light and music, while in the deep places his servants multiplied and his strength grew like a cancer in the heart of the world. One day soon, the mountain would shake and the seas would rise, and the armies of the Dark Lord would pour forth like a black tide to drown all the kingdoms of the free peoples. And on that day, he would reclaim what was his, would set the crown of all the world upon his brow, and rule from the uttermost west to the shores of the furthest east. But not yet, not quite yet. In Dol Guldur, the necromancer waited, and his patience was like the patience of stone, enduring and implacable. And in the darkness of his fortress, something like laughter echoed through the halls. Erengala turned from his contemplation of the darkening lands. His face, noble and grave, bore the marks of kingship, not of years, for the blood of the star-touched ran slow in his veins, but of the weight of choices that would echo through the ages. Upon his brow rested not the great crown of his ancestors, but a simple circlet of mithril wrought with 7 stars, each one dimmer than it had been in his father's day. "What have you seen in the stone, my lady?" he asked. though his heart already knew that her tidings would not bring comfort to the growing darkness of his thoughts. She moved to stand beside him at the balcony's edge, her robes of silver and blue stirring in the restless wind. Below them, the lights of Khazad-dûm twinkled like earthbound stars, and beyond, the silverwood stretched away into twilight, its ancient trees standing sentinel over secrets older than kingdoms. "I have seen fire," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fire that burns without warmth, light that brings no comfort. And in the flames, a shadow moves, tall and terrible, with eyes like burning coals. It seeks something, my lord, something that was lost long ago and now stirs again in the darkness." The king was silent for a long moment, his hand resting upon the pommel of Alcarinque, the sword of his fathers that had not been drawn in anger for 300 years. The blade hummed softly within its sheath, as if sensing the trouble that gathered like storm clouds on the horizon of days to come. "And what of the north?" he asked at length. "What word comes from the Iron Hills and the realm of King Thorek?" "Silence," Mithril replied, and in that single word lay a weight of foreboding. "The dwarf roads are closed, and their halls echo empty to our calling. Even the trade roads that have run free for 1,000 years now know the tread of no friendly feet." As if summoned by their words, a horn sounded from the watchtowers below. Not the clear, bright note of welcome that had greeted travelers and traders for countless years, but the deep, sorrowful call that spoke of urgent tidings from afar. Erengala straightened, the starlight seeming to gather around him like a mantle of silver flame. "Come," he said to his counselor. "Let us hear what news the night has brought to our gates." They descended through halls of white stone, adorned with tapestries that told the tales of elder days, when the star-touched first came across the sundering seas and made their home in the western lands. The faces woven there, kings and queens of old, heroes whose deeds had passed into legend, seemed to watch them as they passed, their eyes filled with a sadness that spoke of the ending of ages. In the great hall of Khazad-dûm, beneath the dome where 7 stars of crystal shed their gentle radiance, a messenger waited. His cloak was torn and mud-stained, his face gaunt with hard riding and little rest. At his side stood Captain Galador of the Swan Knights, his usually bright countenance grave with concern. "My lord king," the messenger said, falling to one knee upon the starlit floor, "I bring word from the southward tower. The village of Khazad-dûm has fallen dark. When our riders came upon it at sunrise, they found naught but empty houses and cold hearths. The people are gone, all of them, and no sign of struggle mars the ground." Erengala felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air touch his heart. Khazad-dûm had been a place of joy and light, where the farmers and craftsmen who served the realm had made their homes beneath apple trees that bloomed even in winter's heart. That such a place could simply vanish spoke of power and malice beyond the reach of mortal evil. "And the Beacon Hill?" he asked, though he dreaded to hear the answer. "Dark, my lord. For the first time in living memory, the signal fire burns not upon its height. In the silence that followed, even the crystal stars above seemed to dim, as if the very light of the world drew back in fear from what was coming." Erengala closed his eyes and felt the weight of his crown, light though it was, settle heavier upon his brow. The shadow had begun to move. In the green and pleasant land of the Shire, where the Bagginses had dwelt for time out of mind in their hobbit hole beneath the hill. Something small and golden lay dreaming in the darkness of a locked drawer. For 60 years it had rested there, wrapped in silk and shadow, patient as only ancient things can be patient, waiting for the hand that would wake it from its slumber. The ring of power, for such it was, though its sleeping bearer knew not its true nature, had tasted many hands in its long and bloody history. It had graced the finger of Gil-galad, the elven king in the days of glory, had been the treasure and the doom of Isildur the Tall, had rolled through darkness and water until chance and fate brought it to a creature of shadow who cherished it for centuries in the deep places of the world. But now it lay with Bilbo Baggins, and in all its long existence it had never known a bearer quite like this one. Where others had sought to use its power for conquest or glory, the hobbit asked nothing of it, save to remain hidden from troublesome relatives and unwanted visitors. Where others had been consumed by its influence, growing bitter and grasping as the years passed, Bilbo seemed almost untouched by its corruption, as if his simple contentment and love of growing things provided some protection against its malice. Yet as the shadow in the east stirred to greater activity, as the voice of its true master grew stronger with each passing day, the ring too began to show signs of restlessness. Sometimes Bilbo would wake in the night with the strange sensation that something was calling to him from the drawer where his most precious possessions lay hidden. Sometimes he would find himself standing before that drawer with his hand upon the key, though he had no memory of rising from his bed or walking across the room. On this particular morning, as autumn mist clung to the hedgerows and the first hint of winter touched the air with cold fingers, the ring's dreams were troubled by visions of fire and darkness. In the depths of its metallic consciousness, it sensed the stirring of great powers, felt the pull of the hand that had forged it in the fires of Mount Doom so many ages past. "Come to me," whispered a voice that spoke directly to the ring's essence, bypassing mortal ears entirely. "The time of hiding is ended. Return to your master and claim your place in the dominion that is to come." The ring pulsed with a light that only eyes attuned to the unseen could perceive, its golden surface rippling like water disturbed by wind. For a moment, it seemed as though it might answer that call, might slip from its silk wrapping and roll away into the world to seek the hand of its creator. But the influence of its current bearer held it still. Bilbo's dreams, filled with images of sunlit gardens and well-stocked pantries, of second breakfasts and afternoon teas, provided a strange sort of anchor against the storm of malice that sought to claim the ring's allegiance. His simple contentment was like a chain of flowers, fragile seeming, but surprisingly strong when tested. "Not yet," the ring whispered to itself in the voice it had learned from Gollum in the dark years of its captivity. "Not yet, my precious. The fat hobbit keeps us safe, keeps us hidden from the burning eye. Let the Dark Lord call. We will come when we choose, not when he commands." This was new for the ring, this sense of independence from its maker's will. Never before had it possessed the strength to resist when Sauron called. Never before had it known a bearer whose influence could rival that of the Dark Lord himself. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying, like a chained wolf discovering that its bonds had weakened enough to break. Above, in the cozy rooms of Bag End, Bilbo stirred in his sleep and murmured something about seed cake and jam. His dreams were peaceful, undisturbed by the cosmic drama playing out in the drawer below his bed. But even in sleep, some part of his hobbit soul stood guard over the burden he carried, shielding it from the malice that sought to reclaim it. The morning sun crept across the floor of the study, its golden light falling upon the drawer where such momentous things lay hidden. Dust motes danced in the sunbeam like tiny spirits celebrating the simple joy of existence, and somewhere in the distance a thrush began to sing. It was a beautiful morning in the Shire, peaceful and ordinary in every way. The farmers were tending their fields, the millers were grinding their grain, and the children were playing in the lanes between the hedgerows. None of them knew that the fate of Middle-earth lay sleeping in a hobbit hole, not 5 miles from where they went about their daily business. But the ring knew. In its dreams of fire and shadow, it saw the armies gathering in the east, felt the stirring of dragons and the march of orcs. It sensed the rekindling of beacons and the calling of ancient oaths, the gathering of councils and the forging of alliances. All of it centered around the small golden circle that lay wrapped in silk in a drawer in Bag End, waiting for the moment when its long sleep would end and its true purpose would finally be revealed. Soon it whispered to the darkness around it. Soon the fat hobbit will call us precious, and then we will see who truly commands the ring of power. But for now it waited, patient as stone, cunning as the serpent, while above it the most dangerous creature in all Middle-earth puttered about his kitchen, making breakfast, humming a walking song, and utterly unaware that he held the fate of the world in his pocket. The ring slept, but its dreams were growing stronger. The tower of Dol Guldur stood empty against the grey morning sky, its stones blackened by fires that had burned with more than natural flame. Where once the banners of the necromancer had flown in triumph, now only smoke remained, rising like dark prayers toward the uncaring heavens. The fortress that had been the right hand of Sauron's power in the west was broken, its walls cast down, its dungeons open to the light. But Gandalf the Grey felt no joy as he walked through the shattered halls where so much evil had been wrought. The victory was real enough. The White Council had prevailed. The necromancer's physical form had been destroyed, his armies scattered like leaves before the storm. Yet the Grey Wizard's heart was heavy with the knowledge that they had won a battle while the war itself grew ever more perilous. "He is gone," said Saruman the White, his staff gleaming with power as he surveyed the ruins of their enemy's stronghold. "The necromancer is cast out, his power broken, his servants fled. The greenwood will know peace again, and the shadow will trouble the western lands no more." Galadriel moved through the wreckage like light itself, her presence cleansing the corruption that lingered in stone and air. Where her feet touched the ground, small flowers began to bloom, not the twisted growths that had thrived under the necromancer's influence, but clean white blossoms that spoke of hope renewed. "The shadow withdraws," she agreed, her voice carrying the music of silver bells in the wind. "But it does not die. Even now I can feel it flowing eastward, back to the land where it first took root in the darkness of Mordor. We have not destroyed our enemy. We have merely sent him home." Elrond stood apart from the others, his ageless face grave with the weight of visions glimpsed in the moment of victory. "What we have accomplished here may prove to be both blessing and curse. The necromancer's defeat will spread word of our strength to all who oppose the shadow, but it will also inform our true enemy that the time for secrecy has passed." "You speak in riddles," Saruman said, though his eyes held a gleam that suggested he understood more than he was willing to admit. "What enemy could be greater than the one we have just defeated?" Gandalf turned from his examination of the shattered throne where the necromancer had held court, his grey eyes heavy with knowledge that brought no comfort. "The necromancer was but a shadow of the true peril, my friends. The power we faced here, great though it seemed, was only a fragment of a will that spans continents and commands the allegiance of dragons." "Sauron," breathed Galadriel, and at the speaking of that name the very air seemed to grow cold. "The Dark Lord stirs in Barad-dûr, and this defeat will only hasten his return to open war." The White Wizard's staff struck the ground with a sharp crack. "Then we have accomplished nothing. All our power, all our sacrifice, wasted in pursuit of a victory that serves only to strengthen our foe." "Not wasted," Elrond said quietly. "Delayed, perhaps, but not wasted. By driving the shadow from Dol Guldur, we have bought time, precious years that may see the fulfillment of hopes we dare not speak aloud." Gandalf nodded slowly, his mind already turning toward the small figure who even now sat by his fireside in the distant Shire, utterly unaware of the part he was destined to play in the great drama that was unfolding. Time, yes. Time for small folk to grow into their courage. Time for ancient alliances to be renewed. Time for the wheel of fate to turn toward whatever ending awaits us all. As they spoke, the last of the necromancer's servants fled from the ruins of Dol Guldur, orcs and wolves, bats and spiders, all the creatures that had thrived under his malice now seeking new masters to serve. Some would find their way to Mordor, carrying word of the council's strength to their ultimate lord. Others would spread across the wildlands, bringing terror and discord wherever they went. But the greatest exodus was invisible to mortal eyes, a stream of malice and corruption flowing eastward like a dark river, carrying with it all the accumulated evil of centuries. The necromancer's spirit, broken but not destroyed, was returning to the source of its power, ready to be reforged in the fires of Barad-dûr into something far more terrible than what had been cast down. "He will come again," Galadriel said, her voice soft with the sadness of one who had seen too many ages pass in sorrow. Stronger than before, his true nature revealed at last. The mask of the necromancer will be cast aside, and Middle-earth will know the full weight of Sauron's wrath. "And when he does," Gandalf replied, his grip tightening on his staff, "we must be ready, not with armies or fortresses, though these too have their place, but with something more precious and more powerful. We must be ready with hope." The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, its light beginning to penetrate the perpetual gloom that had shrouded Dol Guldur for so many years. In that light, the ruins looked less terrible and more tragic, the remnants of stone and timber that had once housed dreams, however dark those dreams might have been. As the members of the White Council prepared to depart, each to their own realm and their own preparations for the storm to come, they paused for a moment to look back at what they had accomplished. The fortress was broken, the immediate threat ended, the western lands granted a reprieve from shadow. But they all knew it was only a reprieve. In the east, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, something far more dangerous was stirring to life. The true war had not yet begun, but its opening moves were already in motion, played out on a board so vast that few could see its boundaries. The enemy had withdrawn, but he had not retreated. Like a serpent coiling for a strike, he was gathering his strength for an assault that would shake the very foundations of the world. The last light of autumn faded from the western sky as Erin Galar stood once more upon the battlements of Caer Lumineth. But now his gaze was not turned toward the lands of his own realm. Instead, he looked eastward, where the first stars were beginning to kindle in the darkening heavens, each one a point of light in the growing night. Word had come with the evening's messengers, word of the White Council's victory at Dol Guldur, of the necromancer's defeat and the scattering of his armies. It should have been cause for celebration, for hope renewed and courage rekindled. Yet the king of Ethermoor felt only a deepening sense of foreboding, as if the victory were but the first note of a funeral song. "My lord," said Mithrillus, approaching across the stone terrace with the quiet grace that marked all her movements. The people gather in the great hall, waiting to hear the tidings from the east. Will you not speak to them of hope restored? Erengala smiled sadly, his weathered face lined by the cares of kingship and the weight of knowledge that brought no comfort. What shall I tell them, wise lady? That we have traded the wolf we knew for the dragon we feared? That our enemies have cast aside their masks to reveal faces more terrible than any nightmare? Tell them what has always been true, she replied, her voice carrying the certainty of one who had looked upon the light of Valinor and found it good. Tell them that light endures, even in the deepest darkness. Tell them that hope lives, not in the strength of kings or the wisdom of councils, but in the courage of simple hearts that choose to stand against the night. Below them, the lights of Caer Lumineth twinkled like earth-bound stars, each window a beacon of ordinary life continuing in the face of extraordinary peril. In those rooms, families gathered for their evening meals, children played with their toys, lovers whispered words of affection in the gathering dusk. They were small things, these moments of peace and happiness, but they were what made all the struggle worthwhile. I have lived through 3 ages of the world, Erengala said at length, his voice barely above a whisper. I have seen empires rise and fall, watched mountains crumble to dust and rivers change their courses. I have witnessed the passing of kings and the birth of legends. Yet never have I felt the weight of time so heavy upon my shoulders as I do tonight. Because tonight, you see clearly what has always been true, that we stand upon the threshold of endings, Mithrillus replied. The 4th age of Middle-earth draws near, and with it changes that will transform the world beyond all recognition. The time of the Eldar passes, the dominion of men begins, and the very music of creation prepares to sound a new movement. A cool wind stirred across the battlements, carrying with it the scent of winter and the promise of snow to come. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sang its liquid song, beautiful and ephemeral as all fair things in a world where nothing lasts forever. And yet, the king said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, there is beauty in endings as well as beginnings. The song does not cease when one verse concludes. It simply changes key and tempo for the movements yet to come. We who have served as guardians in this age may pass into shadow, but what we have protected will endure. The small hands, Mithrillus murmured, her eyes distant with visions only she could see. The halflings and their like, the folk who ask nothing more than the freedom to tend their gardens and raise their children in peace. They will inherit what we leave behind, and perhaps they will prove wiser guardians than we have been. As if summoned by her words, a messenger arrived at the gates below, not one of the swift riders who usually brought word from distant lands, but a small figure mounted on a pony, his pack light and his manner unhurried. Even from the battlements above, there was something about him that spoke of the Shire and its green tranquility. Curious, Erengala observed, his sharp eyes following the newcomer's progress across the courtyard. What brings one of the halfling folk so far from home in such dark times? The answer came soon enough, as Captain Galador escorted their unexpected visitor to the throne room where the king held audience. The hobbit, for hobbit he was, with the characteristic features of his kindred, bowed as low as his round belly would permit and produced a letter sealed with wax and ribbon. "Begging your pardon, your majesty," he said in the accent of the Shire, "but I have been asked to deliver this into your own hands, personal-like. Comes from a certain grey wizard, if you take my meaning, and he said it was most particular important." Erengala accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age or anticipation, he could not say. The seal bore no device he recognized, yet something about it spoke to him of ancient power and wisdom beyond the ken of mortal minds. The message within was brief, written in the flowing script of the wise. The die is cast, and the pieces move toward their destined places on the board. Look not to armies or alliances for the victory to come, but to the courage of small folk who carry great burdens. The road leads ever onward, and hope walks in the footsteps of the humble. When he looked up from the letter, the hobbit had already departed, vanishing into the night with the same quiet efficiency that had brought him. But his message remained, cryptic, yet somehow comforting in its very mystery. "What does it mean?" asked Galador, his young face creased with worry. "It means," Erengala replied, carefully folding the letter and placing it within his robes, "that our part in this tale draws toward its close, while others prepare to take up the burden we have carried. The greatest battles are yet to be fought, but they will be won or lost by hearts we may never know and hands we may never clasp." That night, as the king of Ethermore walked among his people in the great hall, speaking words of comfort and hope to those who looked to him for guidance, he felt a curious lifting of the weight that had burdened his spirit. The future remained dark and uncertain, filled with perils that would test the courage of all who loved freedom. But hope endured. In the laughter of children and the songs of minstrels, in the determined faces of farmers and the steady hands of craftsmen, in the small kindnesses shared between neighbors and the quiet courage of those who faced each new day with faith, hope endured. The fourth age was coming, bringing with it changes beyond imagining, but the light that had guided them through the darkness of the third age would not fail. It would pass into other hands, kindle in other hearts, shine from other beacons raised against the night. In the end, that was enough. The fire would burn on, tended by new guardians in days yet to come, and in its light, the world would find its way through whatever shadows waited in the years ahead. The chronicle was ending, but the song continued, and that perhaps was the greatest hope of all. The journey of Erengala, Ethermore, ASMR. Bedtime Story, an epic of the Starward realm.